The howling prairie winds carried a thunderous racket as the stagecoach rumbled across the dusty trail leading to Whispering Pines, Colorado. It was the summer of 1876, and the merciless August sun beat down upon the weathered coach as it made its final approach toward the settlement that lay nestled between rolling hills and pine forests. Inside the stagecoach, Katherine Grace clung desperately to consciousness, her wedding dress crumpled and damp with sweat as fever ravaged her body. "Miss, we're nearly there," the driver called back, his voice barely audible over the creaking of wheels and the pounding in Katherine's head. "Just hold on a little longer." Katherine's gloved hand trembled as she pressed it against the window. The world outside swam in her vision: blurry mountains, indistinct buildings, and the golden haze of summer dust. She had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to marry a man she'd only exchanged letters with, and now she feared she might die before even meeting him. When the stagecoach finally lurched to a stop in front of Whispering Pines' only hotel, Katherine could barely lift her head. Her chestnut hair, once elegantly pinned, now hung in loose, damp strands around her flushed face. At 23, she had never felt so utterly alone and afraid. "Driver, we need help here," a woman's voice called from outside. "The passenger looks mighty ill." Katherine felt rough hands helping her from the coach. Her legs buckled beneath her and the world tilted dangerously. "Where's Thomas Blackwell?" she managed to whisper, referring to her fiancé. "He was supposed to meet me." The hotel proprietress, a stout woman with kind eyes, exchanged glances with the driver. "I'm afraid Mr. Blackwell rode out to his claim 3 days ago. There was trouble with claim jumpers. He left word he'd be delayed meeting his bride." Katherine felt consciousness slipping away as she processed these words. She had come all this way, and now, "Madam, she's burning up something fierce," said a deep male voice nearby. "We need to get a doctor." That was the last thing Katherine heard before darkness claimed her. Roy Patterson wiped sweat from his brow as he finished shoeing the last of Widow Jensen's horses. At 28, he had established himself as one of the finest blacksmiths and horse trainers in the territory. His broad shoulders and calloused hands spoke of years of honest labor, while his quiet demeanor hid a sharp mind and a kind heart. "That'll do her, Mrs. Jensen," he said, patting the mare's flank. "She won't be throwing any more shoes for a good long while." The elderly woman smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Roy. I don't know what this town would do without you." As he gathered his tools, commotion from the stagecoach arrival caught his attention. He watched as several people rushed to help someone from the coach, a woman in what appeared to be a fine dress, though it was difficult to tell from this distance. "Poor thing," Mrs. Jensen remarked. "That's Thomas Blackwell's mail-order bride, I reckon. Looks like she's taken ill on the journey." Roy frowned. "Blackwell's not here to receive her," rode out to his claim. "There's been trouble." Roy knew about the trouble. Everyone in town did. Thomas Blackwell had staked a promising gold claim in the foothills, but had been feuding with the neighboring miners for weeks. It had grown increasingly hostile. He watched as they carried the unconscious woman toward the hotel. Something about her pale face and the helpless way her hand dangled stirred something in him. Before he realized what he was doing, Roy was striding across the dusty street. "Mrs. Holloway," he called to the hotel proprietress. "Is there anything I can do to help?" The woman looked relieved to see him. "Roy Patterson, you're just the man we need. Doc Murphy's gone to deliver the Wilson baby out at their homestead. Won't be back till tomorrow at the earliest. This poor girl's burning with fever." Roy glanced down at the unconscious woman. Even in her disheveled state, she was beautiful, delicate features, long lashes, and lips that remained full despite being parched with fever. "Let's get her inside," he said, gently lifting Katherine into his arms. She felt light, fragile, and dangerously hot. "Has anyone sent word to Blackwell?" Mrs. Holloway shook her head. "It would take a day's ride just to reach his claim." Roy's jaw tightened. He'd never thought much of Thomas Blackwell, a man more concerned with gold than community. It seemed in character that he'd leave his bride to arrive alone. "I'll tend to her," Roy found himself saying. "My mother nursed half the county through scarlet fever before she passed. I know a few remedies that might help until Doc Murphy returns." Mrs. Holloway looked doubtful. "It's hardly proper, Roy, a young woman and all." "My sister Emma can help," Roy insisted. "And you can chaperone. But this woman needs care now, not when society deems it appropriate." Without waiting for further argument, Roy carried Katherine upstairs to the hotel's best room. As he laid her gently on the bed, her eyes fluttered open, briefly green as spring meadows though glazed with fever. "Thomas," she whispered. "Rest easy, miss," Roy replied softly. "You're safe now." Katherine's world had become a nightmare landscape of fevered dreams and moments of confused consciousness. Sometimes she thought she was back in Boston, sometimes on the endless journey west. Occasionally, she would awaken to find herself in a simple but clean room, with a man's strong hands supporting her head while she drank cool water or bitter-tasting herbal remedies. "You need to drink all of it," the man would say, his voice low and reassuring. "It'll help bring down the fever." On the third day, Katherine awoke with some clarity for the first time. The oppressive weight of fever had lessened, though she felt weak as a newborn calf. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting patterns on a wooden floor. She was in a bed with crisp white sheets, wearing a cotton nightgown she didn't recognize. Turning her head, she found herself looking at a man seated in a chair beside her bed. He had fallen asleep, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. Katherine studied him. Strong jawline covered in several days' stubble, wavy dark hair that curled slightly where it met his collar, and hands that even in rest looked capable and strong. He wore simple clothes, a blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing tanned forearms. He was not the man from the daguerreotype Thomas had sent her. Katherine tried to sit up, but the movement caused the bed to creak. The man's eyes snapped open, eyes the color of a summer sky, alert and concerned. "You're awake," he said, instantly leaning forward. "How do you feel?" Katherine instinctively pulled the covers higher. "Who are you? Where am I? Where is Thomas?" The man held up a calming hand. "One question at a time. I'm Roy Patterson. You're at Holloway's Hotel in Whispering Pines. You've been very ill with fever for 3 days. He paused. "Thomas Blackwell is still at his mining claim. There's been trouble there and he hasn't returned." Katherine processed this information slowly. 3 days. "I've been unconscious for 3 days. Not entirely. You've been delirious mostly, but you've taken water and medicine." Roy stood and moved to a wash basin. "Mrs. Holloway and my sister Emma have been helping care for you. I've just been making sure the fever didn't take a turn for the worse." He wrung out a cloth and approached the bed. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her forehead. Katherine nodded hesitantly. His touch was gentle as he placed the cool cloth against her skin. "The fever's broken," he said with evident relief. "You had us worried, Miss Grace." "You know my name," she murmured. A smile touched his lips, transforming his serious face. "You told us. Several times, actually. Along with quite a bit about Boston, your journey west, and your cat left behind with your aunt." Katherine felt heat rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with fever. "I'm sorry if I was a burden." "No burden," Roy said firmly. "Though I reckon there's going to be one mighty relieved fiancé when he returns and finds you on the mend." At the mention of her fiancé, Katherine felt a strange emptiness. The man she had traveled across the country to marry hadn't even been present when she arrived. Instead, this stranger with kind eyes had apparently spent days tending to her. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson," she said formally, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation. "I'm in your debt." Roy shook his head. "No debt. Anyone would have done the same." He stood. "I'll let Mrs. Holloway know you're awake. She'll help you get cleaned up and find something proper to wear. Your trunks arrived with you, but they're still downstairs." As he reached the door, Katherine called out, "Mr. Patterson." He turned, one hand on the doorknob. "Has anyone sent word to Thomas that I've arrived?" Roy's expression tightened slightly. "Bart Wilson rode out yesterday to let him know. We're expecting word back soon." After he left, Katherine sank back against the pillows, trying to reconcile her situation. She had come to Colorado to marry a man she knew only through letters. Now she found herself recovering from a potentially deadly fever, cared for by a handsome stranger, while her fiancé was nowhere to be seen. It was hardly the beginning she had imagined for her new life in the West. By evening, Katherine had been helped into a simple blue dress by Mrs. Holloway. Her hair had been washed and braided, and though still weak, she insisted on coming downstairs for dinner. "You should take another day of rest," Mrs. Holloway fussed as she helped Katherine negotiate the stairs. "I've imposed on everyone's kindness long enough," Katherine replied. "Besides, I'm tired of looking at the same four walls." The hotel's small dining room was occupied by several other guests, a traveling salesman, an elderly couple, and a young man Katherine guessed to be a cowhand based on his attire. At a corner table sat Roy Patterson, now clean-shaven and dressed in a fresh shirt, conversing with a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to him. When Roy spotted Katherine, he immediately rose and came to help her to a seat. "Miss Grace, this is my sister Emma," he said, gesturing to the woman who had followed him. "She's been helping with your care." Emma Patterson had the same striking blue eyes as her brother, though her hair was a shade lighter. She smiled warmly. "It's wonderful to see you up and about. You gave us quite a scare." "I can never thank you both enough," Katherine said sincerely. "Think nothing of it," Emma replied. "Though I must say you've been the talk of the town. It's not every day Whispering Pines receives a bride-to-be who arrives in such dramatic fashion." Katherine's cheeks warmed. "I had hoped to make a more dignified first impression." "First impressions are overrated," Roy said with a slight smile. "It's what comes after that counts." The conversation flowed easily through dinner. Katherine learned that Roy had come west from Pennsylvania 6 years earlier, bringing his 16-year-old sister with him after their parents died. He'd worked as a farrier for a cattle outfit before saving enough to open his own blacksmith shop in Whispering Pines. Emma now taught at the town's small schoolhouse. "And what brings you to our little town, Miss Grace?" Emma asked, though Katherine suspected she already knew the answer. "I'm to marry Thomas Blackwell," Katherine replied, noticing how Roy's expression subtly changed at the mention of the name. "We've corresponded for nearly a year. When he wrote that he'd found success with his claim and was ready to establish a proper home, he proposed marriage." "That's quite a leap of faith," Roy observed, his tone carefully neutral. Katherine met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps. But Boston held little for me after my parents passed. I was teaching piano to support myself, living in my aunt's home where I was tolerated rather than welcomed." She traced the rim of her water glass. "Mr. Blackwell's letters spoke of building something meaningful here, of wide open spaces and possibilities." "There's certainly plenty of both," Emma said kindly. "Though Whispering Pines is a far cry from Boston." Katherine smiled. "That's rather the point." After dinner, Roy insisted on escorting Katherine back upstairs, concerned she had overtaxed herself. At her door, she turned to him. "Mr. Patterson, Roy," he interrupted. "After all we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities." She nodded. "Roy, then, I truly don't know how to thank you." His eyes held hers for a moment. "Seeing you well is thanks enough, Miss Grace." "Katherine," she corrected with a small smile. "Katherine," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her heart flutter unexpectedly. "Good night, Roy." "Good night, Katherine. I'll check on you tomorrow." As she closed the door, Katherine leaned against it, suddenly aware of an uncomfortable truth. She had spent more time with Roy Patterson in the last few hours than she had with the man she'd traveled across the country to marry. The next morning brought news. A rider had returned from Thomas Blackwell's claim with a hastily scrawled note. Mrs. Holloway delivered it to Katherine over breakfast. "I'm sorry, dear," the older woman said sympathetically. "It seems Mr. Blackwell is still tied up with his claim dispute." Katherine unfolded the note, her heart sinking as she read. "Miss Grace, I regret I cannot return to town immediately. The situation here is precarious. I've invested everything in this claim and cannot abandon it now when claim jumpers threaten to take what's rightfully mine. Please accept my apologies for not being there to greet you. I trust you are recovering well. I will return as soon as circumstances allow." Thomas Blackwell. Not a word of affection, no expression of concern beyond the most perfunctory acknowledgment of her illness. Katherine refolded the note carefully, keenly aware of Mrs. Holloway watching her reaction. "Well," Katherine said, forcing brightness into her voice, "it seems I shall have to be patient a while longer." Mrs. Holloway patted her hand. "Men and their gold. Sometimes I think they'd marry the ore if they could." The comment drew a genuine laugh from Katherine. An accurate observation, I fear. Later that morning, she sat on the hotel's front porch, watching the town go about its business. Whispering Pines was smaller than she'd imagined, a single main street with various businesses lining both sides, surrounded by scattered homes and farms. The mountains loomed magnificent in the distance, their slopes covered with the pine forests that gave the town its name. She was still weak, but the fresh air felt wonderful after days of confinement. As she watched, she spotted Roy crossing the street from his blacksmith shop, headed in her direction. "Good morning," he called as he approached. "Mrs. Holloway said you received word from Blackwell." Katherine nodded. "He sends his regrets but must remain at his claim." Roy frowned. "That's unfortunate." "It's understandable," Katherine replied, though she wasn't entirely convinced of that herself. "He's protecting his investment." Roy looked like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Instead, he gestured to the empty chair beside her. "May I, please?" He sat, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "How are you feeling today?" "Much improved, though still not quite myself." She smiled. "I'm afraid it will be a few more days before I'm fully recovered." "There's no rush," Roy said. "Whispering Pines isn't going anywhere, and neither is Blackwell's claim." There was an edge to his tone when he mentioned Thomas that Katherine couldn't help noticing. "You don't approve of Mr. Blackwell," she observed. Roy looked surprised at her directness, then shrugged. "It's not my place to approve or disapprove. And yet you have an opinion." He met her gaze. "I believe a man who asks a woman to travel across the country to marry him should at least be present to greet her when she arrives, especially when she falls ill. Gold claim or no gold claim." His words echoed Katherine's own thoughts, but hearing them spoken aloud made her uncomfortable. "You don't know him," she said defensively. "You're right," Roy conceded. "I don't, and I apologize if I spoke out of turn." An awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Katherine asked, "Would you show me the town? Now that I'm well enough to explore a bit, I'd like to see my new home." Roy's face brightened. I'd be honored, though we should keep it brief for your first outing. You're still recovering. They walked slowly down the main street, Roy pointing out the various establishments: Jennings' General Store, the Assay Office, Hanson's Dry Goods, the small church that doubled as a schoolhouse where Emma taught, and finally, at the end of the street, Roy's blacksmith shop. "It's not much," he said as they paused outside, "but it's mine, paid for in full last year." Katherine peered through the open doors at the forge, anvil, and tools hanging neatly on the walls. "It's impressive. You've built something real here." "That was always the plan," Roy replied. "To build something that would last." As they turned back toward the hotel, Katherine stumbled slightly, her strength beginning to wane. Roy's hand immediately caught her elbow to steady her. "We should get you back," he said, concerned. "I've kept you out too long." "No," Katherine insisted, though she didn't pull away from his supportive grip. "I've enjoyed this. It's the first time since arriving that I've felt normal." Roy smiled down at her. "Normal is good, but so is rest." They walked back slowly, Roy's hand remaining at her elbow. Katherine was acutely aware of his touch, steady, reassuring, and oddly comforting. It occurred to her that despite all the letters exchanged with Thomas, she knew more about Roy Patterson after a few days than she knew about the man she had agreed to marry. The thought was unsettling. The next week passed in a similar fashion. Each day, Katherine grew stronger. Each day, there was no word from Thomas Blackwell, and each day she spent more time in Roy Patterson's company. He showed her the surrounding countryside, taking her on short rides in his wagon to see the nearby creek where the town drew its water, the small lake where children swam in summer, and the pine-covered hills that gave Whispering Pines its name. They shared meals at the hotel, and in the evenings, Katherine would often sit on the porch with Roy and Emma, listening to their stories of life in the West. On Sunday, Katherine accompanied them to church, where she was introduced to most of the townspeople. Everyone was welcoming, though she noted the curious glances and whispered comments. She was, after all, still a novelty, the Eastern bride whose fiancé remained conspicuously absent. "Don't mind them," Emma assured her as they walked back to the hotel after the service. "They mean well, but news is a precious commodity out here." "And I'm the most interesting news at the moment," Katherine said with a rueful smile. "Only until the next stagecoach arrives," Roy added, walking beside them. That afternoon, Emma invited Katherine to Sunday dinner at the small house she shared with Roy at the edge of town. "You'll be sick of hotel food by now," Emma insisted. "And I make a respectable roast chicken." Katherine accepted gladly. The Patterson home was modest, but welcoming: 2 bedrooms, a comfortable sitting room with well-worn furniture, and a kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and roasting meat. "It's lovely," Katherine said sincerely as Emma showed her around. "Roy built most of the furniture himself," Emma said proudly. "He's good with his hands." "Emma," Roy protested from the kitchen where he was setting the table. Katherine ran her fingers over the smooth surface of a bookshelf. "You're talented, Roy. These are beautifully made." Dinner was the most pleasant experience Katherine had enjoyed since leaving Boston. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the kind of comfortable silences that come with genuine friendship. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, Katherine felt a pang of regret that the day was ending. "I should get you back to the hotel," Roy said as they finished the apple pie Emma had baked. "I suppose so," Katherine agreed reluctantly. On the short walk back, they moved slowly, neither seeming in a hurry to end the evening. "Thank you for today," Katherine said. "Your home is wonderful." "It's nothing grand," Roy replied, "but it's ours. That's what makes it wonderful. It feels like a home, not just a house." They had reached the hotel, but instead of going inside, Katherine sat on the porch steps. After a moment's hesitation, Roy joined her. "May I ask you something personal?" she said, looking out at the darkening street rather than at him. "Of course. Why haven't you married? You have a good business, a home. Most men in your position would have found a wife by now." Roy was quiet for so long that Katherine wondered if he would answer. Finally, he said, "I came close once, 3 years ago. Her name was Sarah. She was the daughter of a rancher outside town." "What happened?" Katherine asked softly. "Consumption." It took her quickly. His voice was steady, but Katherine could hear the old pain in it. "After that, I focused on making sure Emma had what she needed, on building the business. There didn't seem to be room for anything else." Impulsively, Katherine reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the step between them. "I'm sorry." Roy looked down at their hands, then up at her face. In the fading light, his eyes were the color of twilight. "Life happens the way it's meant to, I suppose," he said quietly. "What about you? Why Thomas Blackwell?" Katherine withdrew her hand, suddenly self-conscious. His letters were compelling. He described the beauty of this place, the opportunities. "After my parents died, Boston felt hollow. I was teaching piano to children who had no interest in learning, living with relatives who saw me as a burden." She shrugged. "When Thomas proposed, it seemed like Providence. And now?" Roy's question hung in the air between them. "Now, I don't know," Katherine admitted. "It's been 10 days, and he hasn't even come to see if I survived the fever." Roy nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I think any man who'd leave you waiting deserves to lose you." The words sent a jolt through Katherine. Before she could respond, the hotel door opened, and Mrs. Holloway appeared. "There you are, Miss Grace," she said. "A rider just brought another note from Mr. Blackwell." Katherine took the folded paper with a sense of foreboding. Opening it, she read, "Miss Grace, circumstances continue to delay my return. The claim situation has escalated. I've had to hire men to protect my interests. I trust you are continuing to recover and finding Whispering Pines to your liking. I will return when I can. T. Blackwell." Again, no words of affection, no questions about her welfare beyond the most cursory mention. Katherine folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket. "More delays?" Roy asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes," Katherine replied, her voice tight. "It seems Mr. Blackwell's gold is requiring all his attention." Mrs. Holloway clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Well, you're welcome to stay at the hotel as long as needed, dear. Your room is paid up through the month." After the older woman retreated inside, Roy said quietly, "You deserve better than this, Katherine." She looked at him sharply. "I hardly know what I deserve anymore." "You deserve someone who puts you first, who would ride through hell itself if you needed him." The intensity in his voice made her breath catch. "Roy, I should go," he interrupted, standing abruptly. "It's getting late and I've got an early start tomorrow, shoeing the stage horses." "Of course," Katherine said, rising as well. "Thank you again for dinner. Please thank Emma for me as well." Roy nodded, putting his hat back on. "Good night, Katherine." "Good night, Roy." She watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the evening shadows. Only when he was completely out of sight did Katherine turn and enter the hotel, her thoughts in turmoil. The next morning, Katherine woke with a sense of purpose. If Thomas Blackwell wouldn't come to town, perhaps she should go to him. At breakfast, she broached the subject with Mrs. Holloway. "It's nearly a full day's ride to his claim," the older woman cautioned. "And it's rough country, especially for someone not accustomed to such travel. Besides, you've only just recovered your strength." "Nevertheless, I think it's time I took matters into my own hands," Katherine insisted. "Can you recommend someone who might guide me there?" Mrs. Holloway sighed. "I suppose Roy Patterson might be persuaded. He knows the area as well as anyone. Which was how, an hour later, Katherine found herself at Roy's blacksmith shop, making her request. His reaction was immediate and vehement. "Absolutely not," he said, setting down the horseshoe he'd been shaping. "It's too dangerous." "I didn't ask if it was dangerous," Katherine replied. "I asked if you would guide me there." Roy wiped his hands on a rag, frustration evident in every movement. The trail to Blackwell's claim runs through disputed territory. There have been reports of armed confrontations between miners. It's no place for a woman traveling alone. "I wouldn't be alone, I'd be with you." "Katherine," Roy's voice softened, "please reconsider. If Blackwell wanted you at his claim, he would have sent for you." The words stung more than Katherine wanted to admit. "Perhaps he doesn't realize I'm well enough to travel. Perhaps he's simply too preoccupied to think clearly. Or perhaps he's exactly where he wants to be, doing exactly what he wants to do," Roy countered. "And that doesn't include marriage at the moment." Katherine felt her temper rising. "You don't know him." "Neither do you," Roy pointed out bluntly. "Not really." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who existed primarily in her imagination, constructed from carefully crafted letters. The real Thomas Blackwell remained a mystery. "I thought we were friends," she said quietly. "I thought you would help me." Roy's expression softened. "We are friends, that's why I'm refusing. Friends don't lead friends into danger." Katherine turned to leave, then paused. "What would you do, Roy, if you were in my position?" He considered the question seriously. "I'd give him one more week. If he doesn't come by then, I'd accept that his priorities lie elsewhere." "And then what?" Roy met her gaze steadily. "Then I'd build a new life, one that didn't depend on someone who couldn't be bothered to show up when I needed them most." The words echoed in Katherine's mind throughout the day. That evening, she sat alone on the hotel porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The beauty of the scene contrasted sharply with the uncertainty in her heart. She was still sitting there when Roy approached, his step hesitant. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I spoke harshly earlier." Katherine shook her head. "No, you spoke honestly. There's a difference." She gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Please sit." Roy settled beside her, his hat in his hands. For a while they watched the sunset in companionable silence. "I'll take you to Blackwell's claim," Roy said suddenly. "Not tomorrow, but in a few days, if that's still what you want." Katherine turned to look at him, surprised. "Why the change of heart?" "Because you deserve answers," he replied simply. "And if going there is the only way to get them, then that's what we'll do." "Thank you," Katherine said softly. Roy nodded, his eyes on the horizon where the sun had nearly disappeared. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Promise you'll consider what kind of man leaves his bride to be waiting while he chases gold." Before Katherine could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was coming down the main street at a gallop, heading straight for the hotel. As he drew closer, Katherine could see it was a young man, barely more than a boy, his face flushed with exertion. "Mr. Patterson," he called out, reining his horse to a stop. "There's been shooting up at Blackwell's claim. Sheriff sent me to fetch Doc Murphy." Roy was on his feet instantly. "What happened, Jimmy?" Claim dispute turned ugly, the boy panted. "Several men hurt. Mr. Blackwell took a bullet to the shoulder, they said." Katherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Thomas was injured, perhaps seriously." "Where's Doc Murphy now?" Roy demanded. "At the Wilson place." Their littlest took sick again. Roy made a quick decision. "Ride there first then. Tell him what's happened. I'll gather some supplies and head up to the claim now." As the boy galloped off, Roy turned to Katherine. "I have to go." "I'm coming with you," she said immediately, rising to her feet. "Catherine, it's too dangerous. He's my fiancé," she interrupted firmly. "If he's hurt, I should be there." Roy looked like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded curtly. "Be ready in 20 minutes. Wear practical clothes if you have them. It's going to be a hard ride." True to his word, Roy returned with 2 saddled horses exactly 20 minutes later. Catherine was waiting, dressed in her simplest skirt and blouse, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "You can ride?" Roy asked, eyeing her dubiously. "I grew up riding in Boston Common," she replied, accepting his help onto the smaller of the 2 horses. "Though admittedly, that was some time ago." "Stay close to me," Roy instructed as they set off. "The trail gets rough once we leave town." They rode through the gathering darkness, the moon providing just enough light to see the path. Roy set a brisk pace, though Catherine could tell he was moderating it for her benefit. The terrain gradually became steeper and more rugged as they ascended into the foothills. "How much farther?" Catherine asked after they'd been riding for nearly 3 hours. "Another hour, maybe more," Roy replied. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though in truth, her muscles were protesting the unaccustomed exercise and the night air had grown considerably colder. Roy studied her face in the moonlight, then reined his horse to a stop. "Let's rest a few minutes." They dismounted beside a small stream where the horses could drink. Roy produced a flask from his saddlebag and offered it to Catherine. "Just water," he said when she hesitated. Catherine took a grateful sip. "Thank you for bringing me, Roy. I know you didn't want to." "I didn't want you traveling alone," he corrected. "There's a difference." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the gentle gurgle of the stream and the occasional hoot of an owl. "What will you do?" Roy asked suddenly. If Blackwell is seriously injured, Catherine had been asking herself the same question. "Care for him, I suppose. It's why I came, after all." Roy nodded, though his expression was unreadable in the darkness. "We should keep moving." They remounted and continued their journey. The trail narrowed, winding through dense pine forests that occasionally opened to reveal breathtaking views of the valley below, silvered by moonlight. Despite the circumstances, Catherine found herself moved by the wild beauty surrounding them. "It's magnificent," she murmured. "It is," Roy agreed. "Worth coming west for." Another hour of riding brought them to a clearing where several crude cabins and tents were scattered around. Lantern lights spilled from the largest cabin, and several men were gathered outside, their faces grim in the yellow glow. As Roy and Catherine approached, one of the men stepped forward, hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Who goes there?" "Roy Patterson from Whispering Pines," Roy called back. "I've brought medical supplies, and Miss Grace, Mr. Blackwell's fiancée." The man relaxed slightly. "Patterson, good to see you. We've got wounded men inside." They dismounted and Roy helped Catherine down, whispering, "Stay close to me." Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of blood, gunpowder, and unwashed bodies. 3 men lay on makeshift pallets, being tended to by a 4th. In the far corner, on a cot beneath the room's only window, lay a man Catherine recognized from the daguerreotype Thomas had sent, though his face was now drawn with pain, his shoulder bandaged with what looked like a torn shirt. "Thomas," she breathed, moving toward him. The injured man's eyes opened at the sound of her voice. He stared at her in confusion. "Who? It's Catherine," she said, kneeling beside his cot. "Katherine Grace, I've come from Whispering Pines." Recognition dawned in his eyes. "Miss Grace, you shouldn't be here. It's not safe." Not the greeting she had imagined from her fiancé. No joy at seeing her, no relief that she had recovered from her illness, just concern that she was there at all. "I came as soon as I heard you were hurt," she explained, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "Mr. Patterson brought me." Thomas's gaze shifted to Roy, who was unpacking medical supplies from his saddlebag. "Patterson, didn't expect to see you here. Couldn't let these men suffer without help," Roy replied evenly. "Doc Murphy's on his way, but it may be morning before he arrives." He moved to examine Thomas's wound, carefully removing the blood-soaked bandage. Katherine watched as Roy's capable hands cleaned the injury with supplies he'd brought, his movements efficient and gentle despite the obvious tension between the two men. "The bullet went clean through," Roy announced. "That's lucky. Still needs proper stitching, but we can clean it and pack it until Doc arrives." As Roy worked, Katherine took in her surroundings more fully. The cabin was sparsely furnished: a table, a few chairs, the cots where the injured men lay. In one corner sat a small safe, presumably containing gold from the claim. There was nothing that suggested Thomas had been preparing a home for a bride. "What happened here?" she asked quietly. Thomas grimaced as Roy applied a fresh bandage. "Branton and his men tried to jump our claim. Said our tunnel had crossed onto their territory." His voice hardened. "They came armed, looking for a fight. We just defended what's ours." "And was it worth it?" Roy asked, his voice neutral but his meaning clear. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "A man's claim is his future, Patterson. You'd fight for your blacksmith shop if someone tried to take it." "There's more to a future than gold," Roy replied, finishing the bandage and stepping back. Katherine felt the tension between the two men and intervened. "You should rest, Thomas. Save your strength." He nodded, then said awkwardly, "I apologize for not coming to town when you arrived, Miss Grace. These circumstances." "I understand," Katherine said, though she wasn't sure she did. "We can discuss it when you're recovered." Thomas's eyes were already closing, exhaustion and pain overtaking him. Katherine sat beside him until his breathing deepened into sleep, then rose and joined Roy outside the cabin. The night air was crisp and clean after the stuffiness inside. Roy stood looking out over the moonlit valley, his profile etched in silver. "Thank you for tending to him," Katherine said. Roy nodded without turning. "It was the right thing to do." They stood in silence for a moment before Katherine asked the question that had been troubling her since they arrived. "There's nothing here for a bride, is there? No home being prepared, no future beyond the next gold strike." Roy finally turned to face her, his expression compassionate. "I think you know the answer to that." Katherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite her shawl. "I was a fool." "No," Roy said firmly. "You were hopeful. There's a difference." A man emerged from the cabin and approached them. "Patterson, we've got coffee on if you want some." "Miss, you're welcome to use my tent for the night. It's the cleanest one here." "Thank you," Katherine replied, grateful for the kindness. The night passed slowly. Katherine dozed fitfully in the offered tent, her mind too full for proper sleep. She thought of Boston, of the dreams that had brought her west, of Thomas lying wounded in the cabin, and, increasingly, of Roy Patterson, his steady presence, his quiet strength, the way his eyes seemed to see beyond her careful composure to the uncertainty beneath. At dawn, she emerged to find Roy checking on the horses. He looked tired but alert, his face shadowed with stubble. "Doc Murphy arrived an hour ago," he informed her. "He's tending to the wounded now. And Thomas, the doctor says he'll recover. The bullet didn't hit anything vital." Katherine nodded, relieved despite everything. "That's good news." They walked together to a fallen log at the edge of the clearing and sat, watching as the rising sun painted the mountains gold. "I need to speak with Thomas," Katherine said after a while. "Properly when he's awake, but I think I already know what I need to do." Roy glanced at her. "And what's that?" "Go back to Whispering Pines. Start over." She met his gaze steadily. I came west for a new life, not to be an afterthought in someone else's quest for gold. Something flickered in Roy's eyes, relief perhaps, or hope. That's a brave decision. Is it? Katherine wondered. Or is it simply accepting what's been obvious since I arrived? Before Roy could respond, the doctor emerged from the cabin and approached them, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Miss Grace, Mr. Blackwell's asking for you." Inside, Thomas was propped up on his cot, pale but alert. When he saw Katherine, he attempted a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Grace," he began formally, "I owe you an explanation." Katherine sat on the edge of the cot. "Yes, I believe you do." Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. "When I wrote to you proposing marriage, I truly believed this claim would have yielded enough by now to build a proper home, to provide the life I promised you." He gestured weakly around the cabin. "But there have been complications. Disputes. The gold is here, but extracting it has proven more challenging than anticipated. And more important than meeting your bride when she arrived ill with fever," Katherine added quietly. Thomas winced. "I'm not proud of that. When I received word you had fallen ill, I was in the middle of negotiations with Branton over the boundary dispute. I convinced myself you were being well cared for, and that settling this matter was crucial to our future." "Our future," Katherine repeated. "Do you still see us having one, Thomas?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Katherine found her answer. "I think," she said gently, "that we both know this isn't going to work. You're not ready for a wife, and I'm not willing to be secondary to a gold claim." Relief washed over Thomas's face, quickly followed by guilt. "I'm sorry, Miss Grace. You deserved better than this reception." "Yes," she agreed simply. "I did." When she emerged from the cabin, Roy was waiting, concern etched on his features. "Everything all right?" "Actually, yes," Katherine replied, surprised to find it was true. "Thomas and I have agreed to end our engagement. It's for the best." Roy studied her face. "You're sure?" "Completely." She took a deep breath of the mountain air. "I'd like to go back to Whispering Pines now, if that's all right." "Of course," Roy said, offering his arm. "Whenever you're ready." The journey back seemed shorter somehow, despite the fact that they rode at a more leisurely pace. They talked easily as they traveled, making plans for Katherine's immediate future. "Mrs. Jensen mentioned she's looking for someone to teach piano to her granddaughters," Roy said as they crossed a meadow bright with wildflowers. "It's not much, but it could be a start." "I'd like that," Katherine replied. "And Mrs. Holloway said I could stay at the hotel while I look for more permanent arrangements." Roy was quiet for a moment, then said hesitantly, "Emma and I have a spare room. It's small, but it's yours if you want it, just until you find your feet." Katherine looked at him in surprise. "That's very generous, but wouldn't it cause talk in town? An unmarried woman living in your home." "Emma would be there as chaperone," Roy pointed out, "and frankly, I don't much care what people say." Katherine considered the offer. It was unconventional, certainly, but so was her entire situation. "Let me think about it," she said finally. They reached Whispering Pines by early afternoon. As they rode down the main street, Katherine felt a strange sense of homecoming, as though she was returning to a place she belonged rather than a town she'd barely had time to explore. At the hotel, Roy helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he promised. "I'd like that," Katherine replied, suddenly shy. That evening, as she sat alone on the hotel porch watching the sunset, Katherine reflected on the dramatic turn her life had taken. She had traveled west to marry a man who had proven to be more myth than reality. Instead, she found herself starting over in a small frontier town, with no fiancé, no concrete plans, and yet a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Katherine began giving piano lessons to the Jensen girls and several other children in town. She found a small room to rent above the millinery shop and decorated it with items purchased from the general store. She attended church with Roy and Emma each Sunday and gradually became a familiar face in Whispering Pines. And through it all, Roy Patterson remained a steady presence. He was there to help move her meager belongings to her new room, to escort her to community gatherings, to simply sit with her on quiet evenings and talk about everything and nothing. It was on one such evening, nearly 2 months after her arrival in Whispering Pines, that something shifted between them. They were walking back from Emma's school where Katherine had been helping prepare for the Harvest Festival, their path lit by a nearly full moon. "I had a letter from Thomas yesterday," Katherine mentioned casually. "The claim dispute has been resolved. He's doing well." Roy glanced at her. "Do you regret your decision about ending the engagement?" Katherine shook her head without hesitation. "Not for a moment. It wasn't real, what I thought I had with Thomas. It was an idea, constructed from carefully written letters and my own desperate need for change." She stopped walking and turned to face Roy. "I found something much more valuable than what I was looking for." "And what's that?" Roy asked, his voice low. "A place where I truly belong, friends who care about me, work that matters." She took a deep breath. "And someone who was willing to nurse a stranger back to health simply because it was the right thing to do." In the moonlight, Roy's eyes were impossibly blue. "It wasn't entirely selfless," he admitted. "Even when you were delirious with fever, there was something about you that called to me." Katherine felt her heart quicken. "And now," Roy took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "Now, I find myself wondering what kind of fool I'd be to let the most remarkable woman I've ever met slip away." "Roy Patterson," Katherine said softly, "are you courting me?" A smile touched his lips. "I believe I am, Miss Grace, if you'll permit it." Instead of answering, Katherine rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "I would permit nothing less." The autumn days grew shorter, the nights crisper. Katherine's piano students multiplied and she began singing in the church choir. Roy's blacksmith business thrived, and he took on an apprentice to help with the increasing workload. They spent most evenings together, sometimes with Emma, often just the two of them, talking about their pasts, their dreams, the future they were beginning to envision together. On the first snow of winter, Roy took Katherine for a sleigh ride into the pine forests. The world was transformed into a wonderland of white, the trees heavy with snow, their breath forming clouds in the still air. "I have something to show you," Roy said, guiding the horse off the main trail onto a smaller path. They emerged into a clearing where a small cabin stood, smoke curling from its chimney. "What's this?" Katherine asked, curious. "I've been working on it for the past month," Roy explained, helping her from the sleigh. "With some help from friends." He led her inside, where a fire crackled welcomingly in the hearth. The cabin was simple but beautifully crafted, with furniture Katherine recognized as Roy's handiwork. There was a main room with a kitchen area, a small bedroom visible through an open door, and windows that looked out over the snow-covered clearing. "It's wonderful," Katherine breathed, turning to take it all in. "But I don't understand." Roy took her hands in his. "I built this for us, Katherine, if you'll have me." Her eyes widened. "Roy." He dropped to one knee in front of her, still holding her hands. "I know it's been only a few months, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Katherine Grace. I think I started falling in love with you when you were still feverish and calling for a cat you left behind in Boston." His smile was tender. "I want to build a life with you, here in Whispering Pines, Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Catherine's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Roy Patterson, I will marry you." He rose and pulled her into his arms, his kiss gentle at first, then deepening with a passion that left them both breathless. "I love you," Katherine said when they finally pulled apart. "Not the idea of you, not some construct from letters, but you, the man who cared for me when I was ill, who showed me kindness when I was alone, who sees me for who I truly am." Roy brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And who are you, Katherine Grace?" She smiled up at him, her heart full. "A woman who came west looking for a husband and found herself instead. And then, when she least expected it, found love as well." They were married on Christmas Day in the small church of Whispering Pines, with Emma as maid of honor and the entire town in attendance. Katherine wore a simple white dress with pine boughs in her hair, and Roy couldn't take his eyes off her throughout the ceremony. That evening, as snowflakes drifted past the windows of their cabin, Roy built up the fire while Katherine prepared their first meal as husband and wife. "I have something for you," Roy said, reaching into his pocket. He handed her a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside lay a delicate gold locket. "It's beautiful," Katherine breathed, opening it to find a tiny photograph of the two of them that had been taken on their engagement day. "Turn it over," Roy urged. On the back was engraved, "To KP, every fever has its purpose." Katherine laughed through sudden tears. "You impossible romantic." "Only for you," Roy replied, taking the locket and fastening it around her neck. "Always for you." As they settled before the fire, wrapped in a quilt Emma had made for their wedding gift, Katherine rested her head on Roy's shoulder. "Did you ever imagine, when you were nursing a delirious stranger back to health, that you'd end up married to her?" she asked. Roy's arm tightened around her. "I hoped," he admitted. "From the moment you first opened your eyes and looked at me, I hoped." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their new home in pristine white. Inside, the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin Roy had built with his own hands. And in Katherine's heart, the journey that had begun with a fever and a broken engagement had led, unexpectedly but perfectly, to the very thing she had come west to find: a love that would last a lifetime. In the spring, Katherine planted a garden around their cabin, filling it with wildflowers and herbs. She continued teaching piano, riding into town 3 days a week while Roy worked at his smithy. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in magnificent colors, talking about their day and their plans for the future. On their first anniversary, Katherine gave Roy news that left him speechless with joy. They would be welcoming a child in the summer. Their son, Robert James Patterson, was born on a warm July day in 1878, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. As the years passed, Whispering Pines grew from a frontier settlement into a proper town. Roy expanded his blacksmith shop to include a hardware store, while Katherine established a small music school. They added a daughter, Elizabeth, to their family 3 years after Robert's birth, and their cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family. Thomas Blackwell's gold claim eventually played out, and he moved on to try his luck in California. He sent a letter once, congratulating Katherine on her marriage and admitting that she had been right to choose a different path. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard, Katherine leaned against Roy's shoulder. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't fallen ill when I arrived?" she asked. Roy considered the question. "I'd like to think we would have found each other anyway," he said finally. "But I'm grateful for that fever, terrible as it was. It gave me the chance to know you before anyone else in town." Katherine smiled. Every fever has its purpose. Indeed it does, Mrs. Patterson, Roy agreed, kissing her softly. Indeed it does. And as the sun set behind the pine-covered mountains, casting long shadows across the land they had both come to love, Katherine knew that the journey that had begun with illness and disappointment had led her exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of the man who had nursed her back to health, and in doing so, had healed her heart as well.